One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Over 600 million people watched in awe as Neil Armstrong became the first human to set foot on another world. It was July the 20th, 1969, as those fuzzy black and white images came streaming in real time from the lunar surface. People around the globe sat in awe in front of their televisions, mesmerized by what they saw. We watched each step with cautious anticipation, hoping that nothing went wrong. And nothing did. It was a triumph of human engineering and the culmination of almost 9 years of work requiring over 400,000 scientists, engineers, and technicians. The world celebrated this monumental achievement. But what did it take to reach this point? How was it done? And what will the legacy of Apollo 11 finally be? How was NASA going to do this? What was the plan to reach the moon? Well, it consisted of several phases. First, the most powerful rocket ever built had to be created in order to lift all the necessary equipment and crew off the Earth. This was the giant Saturn V, a 3-stage vehicle which created 7.5 million pounds of thrust, creating one of the loudest sounds ever produced by man. Second, the crew must have a craft that could sustain them for the trip to the moon and return. It had to supply all the fuel, food, water, and air necessary within a comfortable environment for a long journey. NASA calculated that it would take 4 days just to travel the distance to the moon, 238,000 miles. This is a distance so great that all the planets would fit easily within it. Next, we have the most unique piece of the plan to land on the moon. Like the Command Service Module, the Lunar Excursion Module, LEM, would have to supply the same basic amenities in support of the astronauts. However, it must also provide the ability to both land on the moon and take off from it, while providing sufficient space for the astronauts to work while on the surface. It's important to note that the LEM was the first vehicle ever designed and built to function with humans on another celestial body, a designation which remains to this day. The only other additional thing they would need are spacesuits to walk on the lunar surface and protect them from the vacuum of space and the searing 250-degree-plus heat of lunar daytime. To those watching at home on TV, it all looks so easy. Yet the road that led to this epic moment was filled with small steps, inspiring moments, a world war, and occasional tragedy. The long road to landing on the moon began in 1903, Tsarist Russia, with a self-taught genius named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. He published a paper that year where he calculated the speed necessary to reach a minimal Earth orbit, 17,500 miles per hour. He also wrote that this could be accomplished in a multi-stage rocket fueled by liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, the fuel that would later power part of the enormous Saturn V rocket. If that wasn't enough, he was also the first scientist to advocate human space flight. It was 1926. Working in the United States, a physicist named Dr. Robert Goddard developed a working liquid-fueled rocket based and flown on the designs created by Tsiolkovsky 23 years previously. This development was as significant to the history of spaceflight as the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk was to aviation. And as a result, he is considered to be the father of modern rocketry. October the 4th, 1957, America received a rude wake-up call from the Soviet Union. The Russians had just launched a satellite into Earth orbit. It was called Sputnik. Tiny by today's standards, its present flying high above the U.S. caused panic as this tiny beeping radio transmitter orbited the Earth 359 miles overhead and completing one orbit every 90 minutes. Yet this was the height of the Cold War. How had the USSR gotten so far ahead of America, people ask. The government knew they must do something to match it, and they must do it fast.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fine command, fine command. Fuel tank pressurized. Rocket tank pressurized, missile power. Ignition, base.
4 months after the launch of Sputnik, America launched its first satellite, Explorer 1, in January 1958. People across the country could now look up and see an American artificial moon flying high overhead. As it orbited the Earth, that little spacecraft made an important discovery. It detected the radiation belts surrounding the planet, which were named after their discoverer, Dr. James Van Allen, and called the Van Allen radiation belts. And for about a little over 2 years, people began to forget about space. The presidential election of 1960 saw a change in the White House. John F. Kennedy.
So, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
While the country turned its pastimes to Elvis,
You ain't nothing but a hound dog, the crying all the time.
beatnik music, and the twist was all the dance craze across the nation. Then, the Soviet Union provided another wake-up call on April the 12th, 1961.
Апреля 1961 года в Советском Союзе выведен на орбиту вокруг...
On that day, Russia launched the first man into space from their Baikonur launch complex. It was Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet pilot and cosmonaut, launched into space aboard his Vostok spacecraft, and completed one orbit of the Earth. The first man into space was a Russian. America had been upstaged once again. Created in 1958, NASA had built a one-man spacecraft, but they had never flown it. It was called Mercury. NASA had selected and already been training a group of 7 astronauts to ride in their new spaceship. With America lagging behind the USSR, it must launch an astronaut soon. The selection process was a very closely guarded secret. It wasn't until the early morning of launch day did the public learn who it was to be. Rear Admiral Alan Shepard was a naval aviator and astronaut and would become the first American in space, and would later command Apollo 14 to the moon.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition.
May 5th, 1961, Shepard was launched on a suborbital flight, 115 miles into space, then landing in the Atlantic Ocean about 15 minutes later. Although not an orbital mission, it proved that the Mercury spacecraft would work as designed and laid the groundwork for future missions. But the country needed more. It needed a specific goal, something that had the potential to put America on top and finally beat the Soviet Union. It all came down to President John F. Kennedy. On May the 25th, 1961, only 20 days after Shepard's successful flight.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
NASA was now in a rush to reach the goal set forth by President Kennedy. Put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. A hurried development which would prove to have deadly consequences. Unknown to NASA, there was a flaw in all spacecraft designs that had existed from the earliest stage of Project Mercury and through Gemini and now on to Apollo. The spacecraft atmosphere had always been pure oxygen, a well-known high-energy gas. That fact would prove to be a wake-up call to NASA on January the 27th, 1967. On that day, the astronauts of Apollo 1, Gus Grissom, one of the original 7 astronauts, the second man in space and the commander of Apollo 1. Ed White, the first American to walk in space. And Roger Chaffee, a Navy commander and aviator and the pilot of Apollo 1. We're all in a lockdown test inside the Apollo spacecraft at the launch pad, having trouble with radio communications with ground control.
How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?
The 3 astronauts were working to solve the communications problem as something shorted and sparked behind the control panel of the Apollo command module. What followed next would mark the end of Apollo 1. Tragedy had struck. In the presence of the pure oxygen atmosphere, the spacecraft caught fire, killing all 3 astronauts. This event forced NASA to completely re-engineer the atmosphere and other components inside the spacecraft, a setback that would push NASA almost a year behind schedule. This event also proved the need to always have the safety of the crew as the first priority, a point which had been minimized because of all the successes of the previous manned space flights. The Apollo program was back on track after the disaster of Apollo 1. But information from Russia that they had been attempting a moon mission forced NASA to modify their timetable for a chance to get there first, meeting Kennedy's original goal. The Apollo command module had already been tested and was ready, but all the landing hardware and procedures were not yet completed and tested. Therefore, a moon landing still wasn't possible. NASA devised a bold plan after successfully testing the Saturn V. Send a spacecraft on a journey around the moon and back. The job of flying to the moon fell to Apollo 8, crewed by Colonel Frank Borman as commander, Captain Jim Lovell, and Major William Anders. Everyone knew this would be an extremely dangerous mission. Privately, NASA only gave the astronauts a 50-50 chance of survival, since this was the first crewed flight of the Apollo aboard the huge Saturn V rocket. In addition, up till then, the farthest anyone had ever traveled from Earth was 850 miles. Apollo 8 would increase that distance by 250,000 miles. The basic plan looked simple. First, Apollo 8 would be launched into Earth orbit. Once in elliptical orbit, it would use the Earth's gravity to accelerate the spacecraft to 25,000 miles per hour, Earth's escape velocity, assisting the engine burn which would put them on a path to the moon. That window is called TLI, for Trans-Lunar Injection. From here, Apollo 8 would spend 4 days traversing the distance to the moon. Then, once they arrived, they must slow the spacecraft down to enter lunar orbit, and finally making 8 orbits of the moon. They would be the first humans to see the elusive dark side of the moon, gravitationally locked, orbiting the Earth away from human sight. Each critical rocket burn, first to enter lunar orbit, slowing Apollo to the lunar orbital velocity of 5,600 miles per hour, and later to accelerate for the return to Earth, had to take place behind the moon, out of the sight and without the aid of ground control. Luckily, everything went as planned. After entering orbit around a new world, surprising and inspiring vistas abound. Witnessing Earthrise over the moon for the first time by any human was just such an event. Earth appeared as a blue marble floating in the blackness of space. At that instant, humanity was seen as a whole. We were all one, living together on that beautiful celestial island, the ethereal home of all mankind. This scene has become one of the most important images of the 20th century. It was now time for the ultimate goal, a lunar landing. Yet the road to this point had been long. As we saw previously, beginning in 1903 with Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, there are many milestones covering the 66 years between his published works on rocketry, forward through time to Sputnik, and then on to Apollo. The idea that man could literally go from the horse and buggy to landing a man on the moon during this time is an incredible testament to man's ingenuity and drive. The date is now July the 16th, 1969. At 8:32 in the morning. It's launch day for Apollo 11, as everybody watching held their breath, eyes fixed to this historic spectacle.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower clear.
Once in Earth orbit, the crew of Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong, the mission commander and the astronaut that would become the first human to set foot on the moon. Michael Collins, command module pilot. And Buzz Aldrin, lunar module pilot, would make 1.5 orbits of the Earth in preparation for their long and dangerous journey ahead. The cold, long, dark path to the moon filled the crew with charged yet eager anticipation and conceivable apprehension for the challenges that lay ahead. Soon reaching the moon, Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would enter the Lunar Excursion Module, LEM, for the descent to the moon's surface, leaving Michael Collins alone in lunar orbit, the long-awaited landing at hand.
Four forward, drift into the right a little. 30, count and a half. 30 seconds forward, drift. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Apollo 11 was now safely resting on the lunar surface, as the astronauts, along with the rest of humanity back on Earth, all breathed a collective sigh of relief. Yet stretching around the tiny figure of the LEM lay the stark, empty desolation of the lunar surface. Beautiful in some respects, but still filled with mystery and uncertainty. However, it was now time for Neil Armstrong to leave the LEM, descend the ladder, and fulfill in reality which, up till now, had only been a dream.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
After Neil Armstrong's historic first step on the moon, the next order of business was to collect a contingency sample of the lunar surface to be sure they had lunar material in case of having to lift off early for some reason. To accomplish this critical task, Armstrong had a special scoop to quickly collect lunar soil. This specially designed tool was collapsible to make it easily portable for the first steps on the moon. The next order of business was for Buzz Aldrin to join Neil on the surface. Exiting the Lunar Excursion Module wasn't particularly graceful. Once on the surface, the two astronauts had another solemn duty: read the plaque on the leg of the LEM to commemorate this historic event.
Here, men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969, AD. It came in peace for all mankind. It has the crew members' signatures and the signature of the President of the United States.
We came in peace for all mankind. This is to be the ultimate legacy of Apollo. Exploration for all humanity, not for any individual country or group. All this time, the engineers and scientists of Mission Control were just as captivated by the pictures from the moon as everyone else on Earth. Even in this room, it was hard for everyone to imagine that what they were watching was playing out on another celestial body 238,000 miles away. Still, during the short 2.5-hour stay walking on the lunar surface, the astronauts had several experiments and monitoring stations to be installed, all the while taking pictures and collecting lunar samples. Indeed, this first mission to a new world was more a sightseeing and sample collection expedition than a purely scientific one. After only 22 hours on the moon, Apollo 11 left for home to greet a grateful world and celebrate its monumental achievement. The Apollo program has passed into history, yet the Kennedy Space Center remains the primary American spaceport. The enormous structure of the Vehicle Assembly Building remains in use today, as do the launch complexes where Americans first ventured to the moon. But the old Saturn V gantry, such an icon of the Apollo program, is long gone. The legacy of Apollo now takes many directions, although human space exploration is still at the forefront of NASA priorities. Just as time and events progress, we leave the Earth once more and eventually find ourselves in Earth orbit, with a glimpse of the present and perhaps even the future. Beginning in 1998, the International Space Station has been the cornerstone of NASA manned space flight. About the size of a soccer field and weighing 450 tons, the ISS has the capacity to house 7 astronauts within a variety of laboratories and living facilities. With the assistance of the Space Shuttle, seen here docked, the ISS was constructed in low Earth orbit for the express purpose of studying the effects of long-duration spaceflight, information critical for our return to the moon and future deep space exploration. Today, with the retirement of the Space Shuttle, NASA has contracted with private firms to assist with the continuing requirement of supply to the ISS. Companies like SpaceX, whose Dragon ship now makes many scheduled resupply trips to the ISS, has taken up this critical task. All the while, the astronauts on board continue to refine and develop the technology and procedures required for the future. NASA's goal remained focused on 2 principal targets: a return to the moon and ultimately the red planet, Mars. Even with all that, the words of John F. Kennedy once again ring as a prologue to the events soon to unfold in what is now the 21st century.